Twilight Zone's second season kicked off with King 9 Will Not Return. Naturally, since it was the second season premiere, there's quite a bit of background on the production. This includes the actual event the story was based on, the main actor's involvement in the show, how the episode was received, CBS's budgetary concerns, and more. After winning numerous awards, including an Emmy for Rod Serling's writing in 1960, the series was riding high heading into the debut of a new set of episodes. The fan base was large and engaged enough to send in dozens of story ideas every week, purchase books and other merchandise based on the show, and they even started to recognize Rod in public. He had been known by people within the industry because of his other mainstream work, but The Twilight Zone gave Serling a new level of fame with the average Joe. The show's return was heavily publicized after CBS announced its renewal on May 11, 1960. Fast forward to September 30th of that same year, and the hotly anticipated second season finally hit the airwaves. A new intro accompanied the premiere as the classic theme by Marius Constant we all associate with the show debuted. The on-screen visuals look as if they combined certain aspects of both Season 1 intros. We still start by moving through dense mist, but we meet the black line and sun that is signature to the show's second introduction. The original Twilight Zone logo ends this more abbreviated presentation, as Serling's narration is slightly altered. Speaking of Rod, this is the first time we see him on screen at the beginning of an episode. It wasn't his original appearance overall, but this started a tradition for the show that continued through the remainder of its run. Other potential narrators were once again brought in, however, it was Rod himself who ended up being the perfect fit. King 9 Will Not Return follows Captain James Embry in the moments following the crash of his plane in an African desert. The year is 1943, as he awakens to find the aircraft damaged and his entire crew missing. In the sweltering heat, he searches for them, only to be greeted with mirages as his mind starts to succumb to the hot desert sun. After a while, he sees jets fly overhead that don't fit the time period. Captain Embry continues his delirious wandering as the truth slowly reveals itself. This episode was based on a real event in the news at the time, which concerned the discovery of an American bomber called Lady Be Good that actually went missing in 1943. It was found in the late 1950s with most of the supplies intact and even the machine guns and radios still operational. However, the remains of the crew on board were not immediately recovered. It was brought to light later that the crew bailed with their parachutes into the desert below and died trying to find the Mediterranean coast. The Twilight Zone wasn't the only piece of media to draw inspiration from this tragic situation. The 1964 novel The Flight of the Phoenix, which was later turned into 2 films with the same name, had a similar premise. The second film, a remake of the first, was released in 2004. Soul Survivor, a 1970 TV movie, also based its story on the Lady Be Good. Buzz Kulik directed his first of 9 episodes here, and if Serling had his way, he would have directed even more. The two were friends, and Rod had recruited him as early as Season 1, but Kulik's schedule didn't permit him to start working on the show until this Season 2 installment. Another friend of Serling's was this episode's star, Robert Cummings. At the time, he was known as a comedic actor for projects like the 5-season-long sitcom The Bob Cummings Show, although he did do more dramatic roles like a 1958 episode of Playhouse 90 called Bomber's Moon, which was written by Serling. As the lone actor for most of this episode, his performance was lauded as a tour de force by critics. The whole episode actually received ample praise from publications at the time. One of the conditions for Cummings signing on to appear in Twilight Zone was that if his acting was well received, Rod Serling would submit this episode and his performance for an Emmy. Reportedly, Serling had to go back on his word when another episode, Eye of the Beholder, was said to have a better chance at winning that year. Serling and Cummings almost collaborated again on a Western show that Serling pitched called The Loner. It ended up being made in 1965 and lasted 1 season, but Cummings was not involved in the project. Despite the show's popularity, CBS often tried to keep the show's budget down. It was very expensive to produce at the time, with this episode alone costing almost $62,000. This resulted in several shortcuts in production that were clever at certain times and more obvious in others. One of the more unfortunate ideas to cut costs involved shooting 6 episodes of this second season on videotape. We'll get to those later, but with most of the series shot on film, the quality drop in those installments stick out like a sore thumb. Another trick was to keep the cast to a minimum, which is one of the reasons why the Captain Embry character is alone for the majority of this story. Despite being the only person on screen for such a long time, he has quite a bit of dialogue. To avoid the problem of the character talking out loud in excess, as Serling himself admitted was the case in the series' very first episode, Where Is Everybody?, narration is used a few times for some of the more reflective monologues. Cummings actually recorded those lines before the on-location shoot in the desert. They played them back for him to react to, as we see in the episode.
Or maybe I tied one on and I'm in a booth in a bar someplace with a pretty girl.
After hallucinating more and more, Embry starts to put together that his thoughts don't match up. He doesn't remember how he got there or what he did immediately before. Recognizing the 1960s-era jets flying overhead further confuses him.
Jet aircraft? How do I know about jet aircraft? This is 1943. There's no such thing as jet aircraft. But I know about it.
Embry pleads with whoever may be listening to let him out of this nightmare, and soon after, we see him in a hospital bed. A medical doctor and psychiatrist explain that he went into shock and fainted after seeing a newspaper headline that says an old warplane was recently discovered in an African desert. In World War II, Embry was captain of that very aircraft, but was suffering from fevers and reported in sick before it went on its final mission. His survivor's guilt was triggered by the newspaper's story, and this resulted in his delusion of being stranded in the desert, alone with the plane he never went down with. Soon after, the doctors leave the room and unexplainably discover sand in his shoes. That sand in the shoe bit was another element left over from Where Is Everybody? Serling wanted to leave a similar clue in that episode after the main character came out of his altered state, but the network thought it would be too confusing for the viewer. That was the pilot episode, so they didn't know what a big hit the series would be for twists like that. But by this point, Serling had proved himself with the series, and that beat was of course allowed this time around. While this episode and Robert Cummings' performance were heavily praised at the time of release, personally, I don't think it holds up very well. While the on-location setting and real plane was appreciated, it lacked any variance in atmosphere and the same beats kept repeating over and over. This would have been great as a 5 to 7 minute short, but as is, it feels repetitive, overly long, and not on the level of the similar Where Is Everybody, which had its own issues, but they at least had a whole town square to play with. In King 9 Will Not Return, the mirages and minuscule clues only get this story so far. It may just be a modern sensibilities thing, but Robert Cummings' acting comes off as way over the top to me. It reminded me a little bit of Dewey Martin's performance in I Shot an Arrow into the Air, where he's also driven mad in the desert, but for different reasons. To be fair, it's very difficult to pull off a role like this one believably. You have no one to bounce your dialogue off of, and you have to basically be confused for 20 minutes. Not easy, especially with the amount of dialogue Serling wrote for these kinds of characters. But it also didn't help that Embry called one of his crewmates Jimenez.
Jimenez?
Director Buzz Kulik admitted that that was his call because he wanted to make the character more believable. He said when serving in a war like World War II, people were brought in from all over the country, and to most Americans at the time, J-I-M was pronounced as Jim, so Jimenez. Kind of an odd thing to do, even back then, but whatever. The narrations helped for sure, but he still has a lot to say for a guy all alone in the desert. The visuals in this one aren't bad when they're given the chance to do something interesting. The shot showing one of Embry's crewmates in the cockpit of the plane is pretty creepy, even if they weren't able to exactly match the dissolve where he disappears. Overall, I just wasn't a big fan of this one. It dragged from the start, was overly explained at the end, and relied too much on the words spoken and not enough on the visuals needed to execute this kind of idea properly. I can see why some people would like it, but if I'm going back to rewatch the best of the series, King 9 Will Not Return would be far from my mind. But let's look forward to what else Season 2 has to offer us, as we travel further into the Twilight Zone.
Just laugh, see? Just...